Kind of the first 10 or 15 minutes today to talk about this because I think the issue of an apology, what makes a good apology or what's just kind of a, empty gesture type of apology is something that we hear a lot discussed. One thing that I heard from a couple of group members is the trope of the YouTube apology, which has become a lot more common as a thing. There's a lot of questions about expression of emotions in the context of an apology. And honestly, I think there's a lot of ways that we deal with really bad apologies every day that don't feel like they take responsibility. For instance, oftentimes we feel like there's this kind of corporate or PR speak where it doesn't feel like an apology is genuine and it's just kind of avoiding responsibility. But I also think there's a lot of challenges with the role of apology in real life too, right? One of the challenges is how can we make a space for things like accountability, but also how can we recreate a constructive space for people to apologize and move forward in life, given some of the things that they might have done wrong in the past. So I think that's something that we've got at so far in conflict management, and something I think you all did a really good job thinking about in your reflections, where you were talking about kind of the reflective process of learning about, understanding perspectives, engaging with people in a thoughtful way. There weren't necessarily big issues that came up in discussion that caused there to be big apologies, but especially as conflicts get very heated, or you realize over time that you're going to need to interact with people that you're in conflict with on a more regular basis, the role of things like apologies and forgiveness is really important. One challenge, right, is depending on culture, including a lot of challenges in the United States, oftentimes it doesn't feel like there's a space for people to acknowledge that, they may have come from a less informed perspective on an issue. So it's an ongoing challenge for us to think about how to make an effective apology, but also how to incorporate apology as a constructive part of conflict management more broadly. So it's a touchy and challenging subject, but I think it's one that I think really connects really well to what we've been talking about so far in the class. So last class, we were talking a little bit about online dispute resolution. I was giving you some examples and ways of thinking about this in a bit more detail, including some of the ways that ambiguity and mixed messages come up online versus face-to-face. If your case study involves an online component, right? Ambrosia brought up a really good point last class about how switching to Zoom for things like domestic violence cases brings in some really challenging issues and constraints such as location. It's really relevant stuff if there is some type of remote or online component to your example. But I think ODR is something that we do a lot. It's a lot of ways that organizations structure conflict management. In fact, if you're completing the extra credit, which is looking at an outside organization that does issues in conflict management and mediation, you might check in with the ways that they use online settings for them. Because chances are that they will probably include at least an online component of what it is that they do. So for this class, I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the general things that I noticed in study circle reflections. We'll talk specifically about forgiveness and then move on to talking more about, or we'll talk a lot about apologies. We'll talk a little bit more about forgiveness and public reconciliation a little bit more on Monday. And then a couple examples of public apology, including a couple of the examples that you shared. So again, I have your feedback on the study reflection circles, or the study circle reflections up on Canvas. But I wanted to point out some general things that I noticed, since applying and using ideas from the course will be something that you'll be doing in your final essay too. I really liked your observations about what was learned through the process. In fact, one thing that came up was a lot of people brought up some anxieties that they had going in, or not really being sure what to expect, or worried about the direction of this. Some people even brought up some really good examples about how they might have done similar activities in the past. And it felt like overall, once people got into it, people felt a lot better. Like there were things that you were able to learn about, such as effective listening styles, ways to facilitate discussion, and so on. One thing I brought up, right, is that there was a really good level of respect. And there's also a challenge of groupthink, where, out of a desire to be harmonious, we might at times be afraid to share an idea that we disagree with other group members. So It's a thing to keep thinking about, but I like your observations about this process. I like a lot of the ways that people were bringing up issues that connected well to the course. A lot of people brought up things like collaboration and compromise. Some folks brought up the role of culture and thinking about how different conflicts can involve members of different groups and demographics. And there were some good things like negotiation styles, mediation, understanding the role of a study circle facilitator, and so on. Keep working on those direct connections to JAMP, right? So the use of things like in-text citations or quotes or paraphrasing to help to really show us how those things link up together. And then I thought people did a good job of using details from the study circle itself, so saying, so-and-so said this, or I noticed that this person said this, or I noticed that I was speaking about this. So I like the way that you use those specific examples from the conversation and use notes from them as a way of talking about this issue. So again, if you have specific questions about your feedback and grades that you got on that, please let me know. And again, as a reminder, you have this final paper coming up on December 16th that is revising and updating your rough draft into a larger version. As I mentioned, and as we did a little bit last class, you want to include at least 2 outside scholarly citations. A couple questions come up about what counts as a scholarly source. So my advice for that is the key thing is whether or not this is a primary source that's creating new research. So for instance, it could be that, maybe it's coming from the U.S. Forest Service or Department of Agriculture, but they're doing some new study or work or research that, reveals things related to the wild horse population in Eastern Oregon. If it is doing original new research, that's great. If it's an article that is kind of analyzing or using existing knowledge or kind of decompressing a source from somewhere else, that would fit more under a secondary source. So, another way to think about it is, where is this published? So for instance, is this published in something like a peer-reviewed journal? Peer-reviewed being the idea, of course, that there are other experts in the field that have also looked at this and said, this is worth putting out there, right? So that's something to really think about is, where is this coming from? Is this pursuing original research and so on? And I think there's a lot of flexibility there about what those external sources could look like. You've got some borderline cases. Again, I talked to a couple of folks about this last class. Let me know, and I can figure out sort of if this would fit well for the assignment. And then at least 5 major concepts from chapters 6 to 10. So I mentioned that, again, things like OER could be a really good fit. Things that we'll get into today surrounding apologies could fit into. That's relevant to the process. Chapter 10 is a really relevant thing that you might incorporate because it looks at conflict management in the context of organizations and groups. So if you're looking at something, like the U.S. Department of Agriculture or the Forest Service, that could be a really relevant connection to your topic. So you might think ahead to some of those concepts as a thing to use in this assignment too. I mentioned last class some of the research strategies and things to do. Again, that JSTOR text analyzer, jstor.org/analyze, can be a really great way of dividing up and understanding where to get sources similar to you. So let's talk a little bit more about an apology, right? So I want to transition into focusing on this 9th chapter and some of the key things to learn and gain that come up here. And one of the key ideas here is that an apology, and a good apology at the very least, is focused on a couple different elements. The first idea here is the good apology is designed to express responsibility. So in other words, an apology generally involves somebody who is acknowledging what it is that they did that was harmful or impacting somebody else. So one of the easiest ways to differentiate a real from a fake apology is how attached somebody personally seems to be to the issue that they're apologizing for. So, if somebody says sorry when they're just talking in the middle of a conversation, right, that wouldn't necessarily fit under a formal apology because there's nothing to apologize for or express responsibility for. Or if somebody says, classic I'm sorry you feel that way. That's not putting your own responsibility onto it. So that is one really key idea. Another element of an apology, and particularly by using the word sorry, right, is acknowledging the word regret. So regret being that somebody is upset or is frustrated that what they said or did or had completed was impacting the other person in a negative way. So the idea that there's regret or remorse or that that's visible is a really important element of apology too. That they're showing, I didn't want it to go this way, I'm apologizing for getting too heated, and so on. So maybe you're getting into conflict with somebody else, you're talking about, how often you should manage your work schedules together, like maybe how often you're doing chores, going to the office and that type of thing. And through that conflict, it gets really heated, and somebody, calls somebody a bad word, or really insulting word. You say, hey, we had this really difficult conversation, did not mean for it to escalate and to say that. And I feel bad that it did. So oftentimes you can tell if somebody is really genuine in their apology when they're showing that they really do wish that it hadn't happened. So, I've seen a lot of examples of bad apologies. One of the most notorious, right, of a bad apology came from the actor Kevin Spacey from House of Cards, right? One of the reasons that this was an ineffective apology was that it was seen as not especially genuine or honest because, right, Kevin Spacey was apologizing for his sexual misconduct, and one of the things that he implemented in his public apology was to say, kind of as part of the apology, oh, by the way, I'm gay, and as part of that, I was in these relationships due to this internalized feeling of not knowing who I was or feeling comfortable in who I was, and that type of thing, right? And that apology was really sharply criticized because, right, there were a lot of folks who might be LGBTQ+, and not at all like that, and the idea that his sexual orientation was being used to in many ways try to cover or avoid responsibility for what he did was something that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. So, again, there's a lot of examples of apologies that are done really, really badly. I think this is a particularly egregious example of an apology that did not fulfill its function. So we use apologies in a ritualistic way. In fact, there have been an increased number of folks involved in public relations and advising who are trained in how to manage or deal with policy or with apology. So if, for instance, you have gone too far or you've said or done something to hurt somebody else, there's a general societal expectation that an apology would follow if you did feel really bad about that and you wanted to correct the relationship. Another key idea here, right, is that it acknowledges or corrects like in minor offense. So, for instance, maybe you are presenting to the class and you're trying to take notes and you drop one of your note cards and you say, sorry, and you go to pick that up. So we use apologies in a very minor and small way. We can use apologies to express sympathy without taking responsibility. So again, something like, I'm sorry you feel that way, would be an example of sympathy without responsibility. You're concerned that that person is not doing well, but you're not saying, hey, I recognize that I'm a reason that you're not doing well, right? So that can be a major issue too. And then lastly too, again, fill that ideal role of taking on responsibility, which is hard, right? It's saying, I did this thing that is negative or hurtful, and as a result, I want to build more positive relationships. So Erving Goffman is somebody that we've talked a little bit about earlier in the course. He comes from the 1950s and 60s and is really interested in the idea of stigma, social roles, and identity. So one of Erving Goffman's ideas, right, is that a lot of the ways that we relate to one another are based on norms and rules that we have. So, for instance, what we see as normal or acceptable among one another fits under definitions of norms, again, including cultural norms, such as in South Korea, right? Generally speaking, at the dinner table, it's the elders who speak first, or who eat first, and then age goes down from there, right? So, as Goffman thinks about it, we have norms and we have rules on how we behave and interact in society, and an apology comes about if we find ourselves in violation of accepted norms or values or beliefs. So maybe in the United States, right, we see some of those things codified. For instance, things such as domestic violence, the use of bullying, harassment, and so on, of course, would go against that in a legalistic way, but also in kind of a cultural way. So if you were to start eating in a South Korean household before the rest of your family members, that norm violation could warrant an apology too. So it's a good way to think about apologies as fitting outside of a culture's norms and expectations. If we think about some of the ways that context fits into the equation too, that can be a major source of apology as well. So for instance, one of the major challenges we've seen in a lot of like international and foreign relations have been appropriate use of verbal and nonverbal communication. So for instance, in some cultures, the practice of physically touching somebody or tapping somebody on the shoulder, such as Prime Minister of Germany, would not be considered to be appropriate or acceptable behavior. So a social faux pas or not acknowledging cultural difference and being respectful of cultural difference can oftentimes be a really big source of apology. If somebody doesn't take the time to understand someone from a different cultural background and does something that goes outside of what's acceptable to that culture, that can be seen as a really major issue. So again, fake apologies are an example that we see a lot and are a really big problem. I'm sorry if it offended you, and it's kind of the classic example of a fake apology because it neither acknowledges responsibility for taking an action, nor does it really offer much in terms of expressing regret. So you don't say, hey, it really upsets me that it offended you, or I want to help you out, but it just says, well, guess it offended you, whatever. I think another thing that I notice in particular as a really big missing step in a lot of apologies and conflict management is that it's not often very constructive. So for me, right, if I'm trying to facilitate a situation where people are in conflict, for instance, somebody says something hurtful to somebody else. I not only want to know, okay, you're taking responsibility for that, but also what is being done to correct that or prevent that from happening again. So oftentimes a good apology is one that's proactive in the steps that it identifies to correct the issue or problem. So there are generally 5 strategies that can be utilized in conflict management to effectively analyze an apology. You might consider these 5 if your case study involves any level of apology that comes from any particular group throughout the conflict. For instance, if this is an issue related to land management and ownership, maybe there's an apology that comes out later. For instance, a kind of legal acknowledgement of crime and violence is something that is oftentimes offered in a more formal capacity in a way that has to respond to a lot of political problems. For instance, acknowledgement of Armenian genocide is one such area where acknowledging and creating a public apology might have political connotations. So strategies of effectively dealing with and doing an apology is generally a force indicating device. In other words, kind of impetus or thing that is motivating the apology. So oftentimes, right, if it's coming from a corporation or distributor and somebody says, hey, we're really sorry that there is a bunch of E. coli in our lettuce, right? Oftentimes the force or the motivation is indicated by desire to keep people safe, but also to help that lettuce continue to be sold. An explanation or count of the violation is important. So if somebody apologizes to you with no context, and you don't understand what it is they did, that can be a big issue, right? Oftentimes to save face, we might not fully disclose or share the thing that we are apologizing for, which is a problem. So really explaining what the violation is shows to the other person in a conflict that you acknowledge and understand what it is that you did wrong. And that can be a really big step toward creating good forgiveness. An explanation of responsibility, right, matters a lot too. That is that somebody recognizes that within the possibilities that there was something that they had control over that went wrong. You might think back to the idea of a locus of control, right? An internal locus of control is a belief that you have control over the events over the course of your life, whereas an external locus of control says, you know what, I don't really have a lot of personal control over my outcomes or what I say or do. So an explanation of responsibility is to some degree cultural in that it relates to how much somebody perceives themselves as having control over their lives. An offer of repair, as I mentioned before, is oftentimes a crucial and missing step. What are you going to do to fix this or address this in the future? And then lastly, a promise of forbearance is generally kind of addressing how the relationship is able to kind of move more positively in the future, or how the relationship will continue to grow. Apologies, of course, are not always accepted, but ideally there's this sort of return to at least somewhat how things used to be. That if we lost a lot of confidence in a company that distributed lettuce with E. coli, that through an apology, we feel like they're going to do better at maintaining the safety standards. So promise of forbearance is, if there's a norm violation, what is going to return us back to center? We'll talk about this more on Monday, but forgiveness and the reconciliation process, as you might be familiar with the kind of infamous phrase, right? Forgive but never forget, deals with the idea that, yes, an apology could be accepted, but that doesn't mean that there is a totally clean slate. There are ways the relationship has fundamentally changed, and new sets of issues that might need to be dealt with. Excuses are one way of giving an apology, right? So excuses are acknowledging some type of reason that something went wrong. So excuses can have a kind of range from internal to external, right? So generally speaking, a bad excuse is internal or specific to the person. So if you were to say, hey, I missed a bunch of class, I didn't really want to go, right? That would be an internal excuse and one that didn't go as well. An external excuse might be something like, hey, I'm sorry I didn't go to class, and some event, such as, a major life change in the family has made it a lot more stressful for me to be able to attend and go. So the reason that we might see, at least perceive, excuses more positively as they're happening outside of us is because an external excuse says that it's not about the person and their character, it's because of a good person who was in a bad situation, right? So one example, maybe of an apology that I don't think has been going over very well so far, is everything surrounding Alec Baldwin, right? And that shooting on set of the film Rust. So he's kind of gone the rounds on social media and talk shows of the past couple days, and the thing that really struck me was, he's saying over and over again, well, I didn't shoot them, right? And I think one of the critiques of this approach is that because he is, as I understand it, directing, or at the very least having a major leadership role in the film, there were a lot of things, like problems going on set, in terms of the workers, the standards on set and so on, that he at least has some level of responsibility for. So this is a very kind of externalized excuse that is not going so well. So probably one of the most famous examples of a public apology in the United States is former President Bill Clinton, who of course was impeached for perjury and lying in the case of Monica Lewinsky affair, right? And this is kind of a classic example of apology in the ways that it's trying to deal with some of the dividing lines between personal responsibility versus externalizing responsibility as well. So there's a lot to kind of unpack And there's even been a lot of work in communication research over the years in trying to understand and make sense of this type of apology.
I agree with those who have said that in my first statement after I testified, I was not contrite. I don't think there is a fancy way to say that I have sinned. It is important to me that everybody who has been hurt know that the sorrow I feel is genuine. First and most important, my family. Also, my friends, my staff, my travelers, Monica Lewinsky and her family, and the American people. I have asked all for their forgiveness. But I believe that to be forgiven, more than sorrow is required. At least two more things. First, genuine repentance, the determination to change, to repair breaches of my own making.
So one of the interesting things about this kind of context of apology is that it happened in a national prayer breakfast. So there was a lot of kind of emphasis and audience, including religious leaders, and some of the connotations that it had there. Right? There's this attempt at trying to establish promise for wrongdoing in an effort for repentance or taking on the responsibility longer term. That might be a way to express responsibility, but as is the case with a lot of apologies, I think this one has a lot of problems too. So one of the challenges, and at the very least one of the ways that Clinton described this scandal in the past, was this question of whether or not technically or legally, right, he had lied. And that was something that at least leading up to that point he was very kind of dishonest about, right? There was this famous sentence that he said, it depends on what the definition of it is, when there was a question about the kind of sexual activity that he was involved in extramaritally and so on. There's the challenges in expressing remorse and responsibility. To what degree do we perceive it as genuine, especially when it's coming from public relations, from the president, and we know that there's people like speechwriters and so on involved. And then the question of specificity in defining and explaining what's next in an apology is challenging. What is it that that person is doing in order to address or deal with that issue? Apologies are also deeply connected to culture too, right? So, for instance, in Japan, right, an apology that generally would oftentimes avoid eye contact, right, would be a way of showing that somebody feels like they should be socially responsible for what they did. And generally in other cultures, such as Japan, there is less of an emphasis on excuses. And excuses are oftentimes frowned upon because there's more of a focus on trying to hold that person responsible and over time lead to forgiveness. So the acceptability of something like an excuse can vary a lot depending on culture. And as we'll talk about a little bit more on Monday, the role of forgiveness is an important one when we think about how we're dealing with some of the negative feelings that might come up. So what I'd like you to do is, in the last few minutes of class, return to the folks that you talked to, and using that example that you picked as your favorite, I want you to think through these 5 different steps. And with that apology example, take some time to chat and maybe jot down, what's here and what's missing of these 5 steps.